Hello, everyone. Welcome back to China the News. I'm Christine Ying, joined by my co host, Professor Doug Guthrie. On April 24th, Apple announced plans to invest $500 billion in the U.S. over the next 4 years, including the creation of 20,000 new jobs and the establishment of a factory in Texas for AI servers. Before we get started, smash the subscribe button for more videos like this. Doug, great to have you here.
Great to be here, Christine. Always enjoy my conversations with you.
Thanks. Apple made a similar announcement during Trump's first term, 300 billion over 5 years. What happened with that commitment?
Well, I mean, this is a really interesting case, and Apple's a complicated and very sophisticated company in a lot of different ways, and I've spent a lot of time talking about it, and we both used to work there, and so, um, but often when I talk about tariffs with you, we talk about the fact that tariffs are always passed down to consumers, and it's just not correct to think that companies are going to eat the cost, and it's certainly not China that eats the cost. Apple is a little bit of an exception to this rule. I went back and looked at some of the data on this because I just wanted to make sure that I'm thinking about the $500 billion investment, but also the $350 billion investment that was announced in 2018. And iPhone sales were constant across the Trump tariffs in 2018. And that surprised me a little bit because that means Apple's eating that cost. And so, just to give you a sense, like I often talk again about tariffs of always being passed out to consumers, it depends on the company, right? And so it really depends on what is actually doing. And so here I have to give Apple props and just acknowledge that that's what they've done. Um, Now, the $350 billion investment you asked about, um, these are also strategies for getting exemptions from tariffs, right? And so this is part of the conversation right now, is the question of whether the Trump administration, given the commitment of a $500 billion investment and President Trump has said, we'll think about it. We'll see what we're going to do. And so again, there's a lot of sort of behind the scenes, um, just shenanigans that are going on that are really about the blustery idea of using tariffs to push companies to reinvest and rebuild manufacturing supply chains in America. In the case of Apple, a lot of that $350 billion that was invested to support a number of different things that are already cost issues for Apple's operations in America. And so, now they are repatriating profits. And so, that does give an extra tax piece to the United States. But, it's not like suddenly tariffs are pushing Apple to rebuild manufacturing supply chains in America that are going to radically change the industrial landscape. 80% of Apple products are still being built in China, right? And so this is just kind of the key feature here. But it is also very clear that Apple has, in 2018, announced an investment of $350 billion, and in 2025 they're announcing $500 billion. And again, these are not going to rebuild manufacturing supply chains such that all Apple products will be made here. Still, 80% of Apple products are being made in China, but servers for AI technology, and they are investing in upscaling jobs for employees or for workers in places like Detroit, so that people can have sort of higher end Apple service economy jobs. And so it's an interesting move. There's an interesting chess game going on for sure.
Do you think this new 500 billion pledge is just another PR move?
Well, I mean, I want to be a little careful with the term PR because, this isn't PR in the sense that the money isn't going to come. I think that basically they've said over the next 4 years. And as one of our colleagues pointed out, it's interesting that they're saying 4 years because that's exactly when the Trump administration is ending. And so like they're dividing 500 billion up into 125 billion each year. And they are talking about how to create jobs through the building of this server factory in Houston, and creating other jobs that are about training in AI services and such. And so I think it's real. So I don't want to just say it's sort of a bait and switch. The money is going to come into America. But here again, if people think that that means that we're building the manufacturing supply chains to build iPhones in America, that's just not happening. And so at least not yet. And it's not part of this $500 billion.
Got it. So, well, I had a theory that they're trying to please the White House without drastically changing their global strategy anyway.
I, I think you're right. I mean, I think that again, the cynical version of this, Apple is the most valuable, second most valuable company in the world, second most profitable company in the world. They're worth about $3 trillion. $500 billion sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But for a company like Apple, they can handle this and to your point, appease and please the White House. Trump can wave his hands and say, see, I talked about the tariffs, and now I'm bringing jobs back to the United States. And again, there will be some jobs that are created in the manufacturing supply chain for things like servers, but still 80% of Apple products are being made in China. And so this is a little bit just, we're seeing a chess game that's going on in the political realm.
Well, let's talk about manufacturing. Apple has been diversifying its manufacturing away from China, primarily focusing on Vietnam and India. There are a number of products being made in the US. The high-end Mac Pro, the desktop Mac Pro, has been assembled in Austin, Texas since 2013. Apple is the largest customer at TSMC's Fab 21 facility in Phoenix, where you're located, and then the server for Apple Intelligence. So, can Apple realistically bring its supply chain back to the US and still remain competitive?
The short answer is no. And so you and I have talked about this before, but let me sort of remind our audience in how this works. So one of the reasons Apple is the most profitable company in the world is because it doesn't just work with single suppliers, right? So for example, when we talk about, oh, now Apple can suddenly make iPhones in Chennai because Foxconn has a factory there. Remember that Foxconn is only final assembly. And there are about 50 components and modules that go into a phone that need to be built in different places and then moved down the supply line to final assembly. Right. And so the idea that just because Foxconn has a plant in Chennai and suddenly iPhones can be made elsewhere, yes, they can be assembled in Chennai and maybe avoid the China tariffs coming back because they won't be assembled in China any longer. But the question of whether or not Apple can move its entire supply chain is just the answer is no. Um, Remember that Apple works with about 1,600 Chinese suppliers across industrial clusters that are spread out for each of these components and modules and then final assembly. And the reason it works with so many is because Chinese suppliers find it very, very valuable to work with Apple because Apple, and this is under Tim Cook's and Jeff Williams' leadership, they adopted a strategy where they have, yes, Apple has brilliant engineers and brilliant people who come up with new ideas about how to create beautiful technology. But the real secret of Apple is its prowess as just a brilliant company in sort of thinking about the efficiency of manufacturing supply chains and supply lines. And so one of the things that Apple does is that it embeds its Apple operations engineers in Chinese suppliers so that it can help them make their supply lines run very efficiently. And because there's always industrial clusters around these different components and modules, um, those Chinese suppliers will compete with each other because they want the attention of the Apple operations engineers. And so they will work for Apple for very, very low margins. I mean, when I was interviewing people in the supply chain that were working with Apple, they would tell me 1 or 2%. And they would say, we wish we could make more. And I would say, well, why are you working for Apple? And they would say, we learned so much. And then we turn around and go make our money from Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, and Xiaomi. I've quoted this statistic to you before. Apple controls about 90 or about 30% of the smartphone market share in the world, but they take about 88 to 90% of the profits. And the reason is because of this just very, very sophisticated and complex relationship with the Chinese suppliers. And so the idea that just a single final assembly supplier in Chennai is going to change that, it's not. right? They still need the 1,600 suppliers that are competing against each other for Apple's attention so that they'll work for Apple for very low margins. So yes, we do have, this new, the Mac Pros have been being built in Austin, as you point out, since 2013. And there is this new factory that's promised under the 500 billion. But these are just small parts of what the Apple supply chain is. And, as I've said many times, Apple's married to China. They're just not going anywhere. And if they're going to break up or get divorced, it's going to take a decade, right? Because they'll have to rebuild those industrial clusters and manufacturing supply chains elsewhere.
Thanks. Well, let's talk about Apple's strength and weaknesses. I worked in the services work, and then Apple has a whole ecosystem. I really have to say, as a company, it excels at building seamless hardware and operating system. However, their services really lag behind. For example, Spotify commands 31% of global music subscription market, while Apple Music only holds 12.6. Similarly, Amazon dominate ebook with 80% market share in the US, whereas Apple is really facing challenges getting ebook adoption. So, based on your experience, do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I mean, absolutely. And between the two of us, services better than I do because you've worked in this space. But I will just say, where I think Apple excels is, they excel again, just as I've already discussed, in, their prowess and thinking deeply about very efficient operations management and how to manage the supply chain. And clearly, they're very good at making the hardware that people fall in love with. But, in as much as they market themselves as a company of integrated hardware, software, and services, I think services are the weak link there. I mean, I just think it's just they're clearly, not keeping up and with many of their competitors in this space. And there's a lot more innovation with a number of different competitors. And, even, one of the cases that you and I have talked about before is the failed car experiment in China because, they could figure out how to have the partnerships to build the hardware, but they couldn't get the software right. Like the services just didn't seem to work. And so, I think that this seems to be the company's real weakness. And so even though they talk about this integrated system of hardware, software, and services, they're very good at hardware and very good at operations management, but they seem like really a lot weaker in the services space.
Yeah. Let's be honest, Siri, one of the services, has a reputation of being quite unreliable. It's common complaint among Apple users. Even the new Apple Intelligence is somewhat underwhelming. I turned it off. One Reddit user even said Apple Intelligence isn't just as bad as Siri, it's worse. That says a lot. So, everyone, I'm going to step on my soapbox for a minute to share some thoughts about Apple's culture and why I think they might struggle in innovating in the AI space, given the announcement. Based on my 5 years at Apple and the conversation that I had with internal, external folks, this is my take. So, when I first met Professor Doug Guthrie, he was my instructor for the Apple in China class. I was in the class, and Doug always likes to ask people how long they've been at Apple. So he went around the room and everyone said 10 years, 15, 30, 33. And by the time I was the end of the table, I was 2 months. So I remember that very distinctly because later on I learned that Apple really value long tenure employees who build up influence and connections. While that longevity pays off, it has its perks. It also creates really a lot of challenges, especially when it comes to the Project Titan. We talked about Apple's big bet on building a self-driving cars. Apple poured in 1 billion a year, rumor has it, according to Bloomberg, over the last decade, and the project was finally canceled in February 2024. Why is that? In my opinion, long timers often took charge of these high profile vanity projects. At Apple, we call them black projects. And they sideline experts from car companies like Tesla and Ford, people who actually know how to build cars. To me, in industries like automotive or AI, domain expertise is really everything. But Apple's culture gets in the way of that. So here's my lesson for any company taking on big goals, audacious goals. You have to empower the right people with the right expertise, even if they're new and don't fit the usual leadership mold. So, given that the 500 billion investment includes a huge emphasis on AI, but Apple is far behind leaders like OpenAI and Anthropic. Could this be their attempt to make a splash in AI? Or does their current trajectory suggest they still have a lot catching up to do?
Well, Christine, thank you for that. I just love listening to you talk about these issues, both from, you and I share this experience of having been at Apple, but again, we were working in different parts of the company, and you really saw a lot of what you're talking about from the inside. And to your point, this really does sometimes feel a lot more like optics than it feels like innovation. If Apple wants to lead in the AI space, they're probably going to need to rethink not just their R&D and partnerships, but they're also going to have to continue to rethink how they are structured as an organization. So, we mentioned when you and I met, I was working for Apple University, and Apple University, I think, was a wonderful experiment. They're not the first corporation to build a corporate university. Companies like General Electric and many others had been famous for doing that years before. But when Steve Jobs came back to Apple and then hired Tim Cook and then realized he needed to really think through sort of the culture of the company, eventually in 2008, he hired the person who became my boss, Joel Podolny, who was at the time the dean of the Yale School of Management. And I think Joel's a brilliant guy, and I think he's very, very intelligent in terms of how he thinks about or thought about driving innovation. And we would teach classes on innovation and how it was related to organizational structure and design. And but to your point, it takes a lot of work to break a culture down and to sort of recreate it. And you make a really interesting point, like there were these black projects that people just loved being the stars of, right? They loved getting the project. And we would talk about, being a functionally organized system where people would share ideas across the functions. But when you have these black projects, nobody's sharing those ideas. Like they're just getting all the status of having been named as the leader of a black project. And so, there's this sort of mixed messaging of like, functional organizational form to encourage people to share ideas, but then black projects, which are the big thing. And, but you better keep that secret. And so, I just think the company probably still has a lot of work to do in thinking about how to build a truly innovative culture. Like it's probably having a deep impact on them in spaces like AI and other aspects of services. And so I love your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, we both hope Apple continues to be successful, but I'm being a little sad about the recent innovation because I think most of Apple's success is contributing to their operational efficiency rather than product innovation. We are currently on iPhone 16e, and there hasn't been anything innovative. And when Apple Intelligence was launched, I was genuinely disappointed. So.
Well, I 100% agree with you. And again, you've heard me say this many times, and I'll just repeat it for our audience. But, I mean, these products that were dreamed up by people like Steve Jobs and other technical, creative engineers that brought them up, they were interesting and maybe even revolutionary ideas at the time. But Apple's real power comes through its business and operations management. That's why it's the most profitable company in the world, not because of its products anymore. And I think to your point, there's probably a lot of catch-up work to do if it really wants to continue to maintain its position as a top technology company in the world. And so, and then we come back to this other issue of just like how it's managing its relationships in the United States. And we're going to see how this plays out. We're going to see if it's really just about managing PR or if it's about, innovation and rebuilding manufacturing supply chains in America, or if this whole thing is just really about profitability and avoiding tariffs. And so we'll see. We'll
I
see how this plays out.
I do want to give Apple credit for being one of the few tech companies that actually continue the DEI program. There's been a lot of news about Google removing Black History Month, Women History Month from the calendar, Google Calendar. So I do have to give Apple credit for continuing against tide and continuing to support its internal DEI program. So there's a lot of
Christine,
good
I am
things about
so
Apple.
glad. I'm so glad you brought that up because I mean, what we are seeing in this country is a little bit heartbreaking right now.
I
Breaking it.
can
So,
hand
you know, the
so
idea.
I just figure like the tech titans would be the last ones to the first ones to push back on Trump's second administration. Um, yeah. So
They're
it's been
all
very
vulnerable.
heartbreaking.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, all we can do is just continue to fight the good fight and to believe in the values that we think are so important, like DEI and like diversity and inclusion, and just really, really continuing as a nation of diverse groups of people that come together to dream about big ideas. And the ways in which this particular administration has seemed to welcome just calls of just anti-DEI statements and just even more presidential issues is just heartbreaking. And so you're right. Like we should respect and admire companies like Apple that continue that fight.
Well, thank you so much, Doug, and thank you for all of you for tuning in. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more episodes of China in the News Conversation with Professor Guthrie. See you next time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Christine, as always. And thanks to our audience.